Good morning. Today's lecture concerns the origins of the Cold War. The Cold War and what to do about the rise of communism was the most divisive issue in American politics in the last half of the 20th century. Now, historians are not immune to such political passions. Consequently, there are also offshoots of these two primary opposing interpretations of the Cold War, but we'll just concern ourselves with the two major interpretations. The first is the so-called traditional view, and that is that the Cold War was the fault of the Soviet Union, specifically their leader Joseph Stalin, who was engaged in an attempt to spread communism throughout the world. And then the United States and its allies were forced to respond in order to defend themselves. That's the traditional view, sometimes called the orthodox view. The second view is the revisionist view. This is easy to remember because the revisionists are revising the traditional view. And the revisionist view is that it was not the Soviet Union that was the aggressor in the Cold War. It was, in fact, the United States principally, and then to a lesser extent, American allies. And so the question for educated people, as it always is when listening to a college lecture or any kind of presentation, whether it's in the print media or on the talking heads of cable news or whatever it might be, is to try to understand and gauge the perspective of the person who is doing the presenting. Again, whether it's in the print media or on television or in this case a recorded lecture. So, what is my argument today? Am I giving you the traditional view? Am I giving you the revisionist view? And how valid, how persuasive are my arguments for either one? So make up your own mind is the point, at least to the extent that you're prepared to do so at this point. The ideological origins of the Cold War. First, the two nations involved had wholly opposite political and economic systems. Soviet communists believed that capitalism was evil and had to be destroyed. Indeed, there would have been no communism had it not been for capitalism. Karl Marx, the founder of communism, was specifically responding to capitalism when he came up with the ideology of communism. So capitalism and communism are philosophically linked together and really cannot be separated in that sense, for communism springs from the problems, for Marx, the evils associated with capitalism. His Communist Manifesto of 1848 said, and I quote, "The violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie," important word still used today. It means the owners of the means of production. That's another way of saying the factory owners, those who own the great businesses, the bourgeoisie. The violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway or the control or the rise, the freedom, Marx would say, of the proletariat. Who were the proletariat? Those who worked in the means of production, those who worked in the factories, the great businesses of the Industrial Revolution are the workers. And so Marx envisions a world in which the workers throw off the shackles of their capitalist oppressors, and then they create a utopian communist state. And the ultimate result of a communist victory in the world, the state itself evaporates and the workers now live in a utopia, no government, no state required. What kind of a vision of the nature of human beings that requires to believe that should be opposite. It should be obvious, and it is the opposite of the Christian view that mankind, all men are sinful and evil, and so forth. Well, Joseph Stalin was a true believer in communism. He repeated similar Marxist sentiments on so many occasions, it would be difficult to list them all. And so the argument that Stalin was not a real communist, not a true communist, has to ignore the evidence. Communists believe capitalism is unfair to workers. Communists argue that the workers never receive the full value of their work in wages. The owners of businesses, the bourgeoisie, kept more than their due, which they then called profit. Marx said they should have called it robbery, ill-gotten gains. Capitalists believe that communism destroys freedom. Since people in a communist state are not free to choose their jobs or even their place of residence, communism also failed to produce adequate wealth as it crushes initiative and self-interest. The whole idea of a communist state is equality of outcome in virtually every way. Everyone gets the same. And so what incentive then is there to work harder or to go to school or whatever it might be? The communist state is simply going to tell you what to do and pay you no matter what happens and so forth. So it crushes initiative and it crushes self-interest. So the two nations had fundamentally different views of the world. Ironically, World War II made them allies. So now we're going to have to fall back into the era of the Second World War, as we have to do so many times to understand the events of the last half of the 20th century. And so my point, once again, of the significance of World War II is made and will be made repeatedly in these coming lectures. Before World War II, Joseph Stalin, again the leader of the Soviet Union, believed that Nazi Germany was an admirable nation. A nation that was evolved beyond the free enterprise nonsense of capitalism, beyond the free enterprise notions of the Western democracies. The German state, you see, controlled the major industries. It was not a democratic state. It was a socialist dictatorship. Indeed, the word Nazi, the full title of the Nazi state is National Socialism, the National Socialist German State, or Reich. And so Stalin actually admired Adolf Hitler and the German socialist state. Stalin believed that the USSR and Germany could work together against the old corrupt empires of the West. Then when Hitler offered Stalin a treaty that would share the opportunity to conquer Poland in 1939, Stalin quickly agreed. In most histories of the Second World War, this agreement between Stalin and Adolf Hitler is given very short shrift or not even mentioned at all. But Stalin was a partner with Adolf Hitler at the beginning of the Second World War. This is called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Well, after taking Poland, Stalin now looked forward to a joint move south with Russia, displacing Great Britain in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Middle East. That's Stalin's ultimate goal, is to replace the British as the imperial power, although the Soviets wouldn't have called it the imperial power, but that's the effect of it, in the Mediterranean and Middle East. You see, for Stalin, democracy and capitalism were the proper enemies. But Hitler did not see the world through Stalin's communist eyes. The operating principle for Adolf Hitler is not class conflict along economic lines as it is for Joseph Stalin and communism in general. It is race. And for Hitler, the German race, the Aryan race, is at the top of the race pyramid, and most of the peoples of Stalin's Soviet Union are way down the ladder. They are fodder as far as Adolf Hitler is concerned. So this agreement between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany of 1939, in Hitler's mind, was not the shape of things to come, but just a temporary expedient. You see, Hitler was an aggressive dictator, and the Soviet Union had the great living space, what the Germans called Lebensraum, and it also had tremendous natural resources that this new German Reich, this German Empire, needed. And so, he stabbed Stalin in the back and invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. As it turns out, this is going to be one of the great mistakes that Adolf Hitler makes in the midst of the Second World War. Stalin, when he heard of the German invasion of his Soviet Union, could not believe what had happened. Legend has it that he sat stunned in the Kremlin for important hours. And for 2 years, as the Second World War raged, though he accepted American aid and clamored for more, he waged a war on the so-called Eastern Front between Germany and the Soviet Union that was not designed to defeat Germany. It was designed to force the Germans into a negotiated peace. And having accomplished a negotiated peace with Germany, Stalin then hoped that Germany and the Soviet Union would turn their might against the Western democracies. And this was the war he had always believed was the right war. The ideological war. The socialist communist states against the capitalist democracies. Then in mid-1943, in one of the great land/tank battles in the history of the Second World War, the Soviets defeated the Germans at the Battle of Kursk. And with this victory, Stalin realized he did not need Germany. But he never gave up the idea that the right war was a war against the Western democracies. Now, by the end of 1944, it was clear that the Allies were going to win the war. By this time, the D-Day invasion has taken place, and the Allied armies in Western Europe have swept up to the doorstep of Germany. FDR's main purpose now, this is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his main purpose now, with the end of the war in sight, was to create a peacekeeping organization and to ensure that all liberated people received free elections. Another way to say this is self-determination. You determine for yourselves what kind of government you want. Self-determination, free elections. And this, of course, is what was called for in Roosevelt's Atlantic Charter. With the Atlantic Charter, just to remind you, is the foundational document of the Second World War for the Allies, as it sets out what the Allies hoped to achieve in defeating the Axis powers. At Yalta now, one of the Allied conferences in February 1945, as he had at Tehran a year before, Franklin Roosevelt persuaded Stalin to confirm his agreement to these principles, the principles of the Atlantic Charter and the principles of self-determination for liberated people. So keep in mind now the Allied armies in the West are liberating nations like France and such, whereas the Soviet armies, as they sweep towards Germany from the east, are liberating the nations of Eastern Europe, such as Poland. And so now Roosevelt wants to make sure that Stalin is on the same page, so to speak, with providing self-determination to these liberated peoples. So Poland and the other nations of Eastern Europe then were to be given free elections according to Roosevelt's plan at Yalta. And Stalin assented to this arrangement at Yalta. But within weeks of the Yalta Agreement, as the war now is very close to being over in Europe, and it's very clear that the Soviet Union does not need the United States anymore, the USSR began to back out of its agreements to provide free elections and self-determination in Eastern Europe. And so the American-Soviet relationship began to unravel because the Americans were serious about this. The Soviets interpreted the Yalta Agreement concerning self-determination in Eastern Europe very, very loosely, while the Americans envisioned something along the line of American-style elections. By April 1945, it was clear that the Soviets, far from self-determination, were creating communist states in places like Poland and Romania. And these communist states were clearly under the thumb of Moscow, that is, Joseph Stalin. And so the Americans were quite rightly growing suspicious of their Soviet allies. Indeed, the Allied arrangement is beginning to unravel. Then in April 1945, just before victory in Europe in May of 45, Franklin Roosevelt died, leaving the presidency to Harry Truman. And Harry Truman had not been vice president for very long, only a matter of a few weeks. Roosevelt had exchanged his vice presidents regularly, especially after the first two terms. So Truman, with a distinguished career in the Senate, keeping watch over war expenditures during the Second World War, now is President of the United States. And Roosevelt, with the common failings of most men, did not anticipate his death, his demise, and he did not particularly prepare Harry Truman to be president. Truman had not long occupied the White House when he took the opportunity to tell the Soviet foreign minister, a man by the name of Vyacheslav Molotov. Molotov is, if you just remember Molotov, that's fine. Anyway, he told Molotov how he felt about Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe, where the Soviets were not living up to the Yalta Accord. And in their conversation, Truman berated Molotov in loud Missouri farm language, all the four-letter words that you can imagine. He berated Molotov for not living up to his Yalta Agreement. Molotov responded that he'd never been talked to like that before in his life. And Truman answered, "Live up to your agreements and you won't get talked to like that." Now, some revisionist historians date the beginning of the Cold War right there with that confrontation between Truman and Molotov. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to work with the Soviets, but Harry Truman lost his temper and started the Cold War. That's ridiculous. But in spite of Truman's threats to Molotov and his strong language, it soon became obvious that Stalin would not compromise on the nations of Eastern Europe. And so this is going to be the genesis of the Cold War, a conflict about what is going to happen in the nations of Eastern Europe that the Soviet Union liberated at the conclusion of World War II. And so in the West, the question became, were the Soviets primarily motivated by their communist ideology and thus desired to see a world that would eventually go red, communist? Or were they primarily motivated by traditional Russian nationalist concerns of security? Now, it was entirely reasonable that the Soviets should be concerned about their own security. After all, the Germans had invaded Russia, and then the Soviet Union twice in the last 20-odd years. So that's a legitimate concern. But is there, in addition to that, then, a determination on the part of Moscow and Joseph Stalin to spread communism throughout the world? This is the great question at the beginning of the Cold War era. Were the Russians trying to conquer the world as communists, or were they simply trying to preserve their own state? To make sure that the world, that is specifically Germany, did not conquer them? The answer to the question is essential. It shaped the American response. If the Soviets were primarily interested in defense, then the Cold War was not necessary. We could have lived with a Russian empire that was primarily interested in defending itself, just as we had lived with other empires in the past. The revisionist historical interpretation indeed claims the Soviets were just interested in defense, and thus an aggressive America created the Cold War. On the other hand, if the Russians were determined to expand, to spread communism throughout as much of the world as they could, a communist world controlled at the center by Moscow, that would require an American response to stop such expansion. Just as we had stopped Adolf Hitler, and just as we had stopped Imperial Japan. Well, this is the traditional view, or the orthodox view. Now imagine, and here's a metaphor for life, the American people have to make a decision about the Soviet threat. If they wait too long, they may wait too long. It may be too late. And the metaphor here is that as human beings, we are often in a situation where we have to make decisions with a time element in it, or with them. And we would say to ourselves perhaps, well, I wish we had more information. Certainly the Americans wish they had more information about Soviet intentions at this time. But that time element is crucial. Most of you at some point in your lives will decide to get married. And you're going to be absolutely sure, of course, before you make that decision that this is the person you want to spend the rest of your life with, at least according to the Christian norm. And if you're reasonably conscious of how important and how difficult the decision this is, and I hope you will be, you'll have to say to yourself, gosh, I wish I knew a little bit more. Maybe you might say, I wish I had a little bit more time, but if I don't act, she may not be there, or he may not. And so you are forced to make a decision without enough information and probably under some kind of time constraint. And this is the way most decisions are made in life. God bless you. Gradually, Harry Truman became convinced that the Soviets were determined to control as much of the world as the United States let them have. And that, of course, if we waited until all that was left was pretty much the United States, then we would not have the resources then to defend ourselves against the rest of the world. And so the Cold War arrives. In late 1946, Stalin sent Soviet armed forces south into Iran. This was hardly a defensive move. The Second World War is long over now. And this was just exactly the move he had hoped to accomplish with Germany before he changed his strategy. Stalin now is convinced we will do nothing. He was wrong. Truman called his bluff and forced the Soviets out of Iran. But Soviet intentions with this move by Stalin were now more clear. This was not a defensive move. This was a military move south. Stalin had revealed much about his real plans and gained nothing. So now Truman is a little bit more convinced that the Soviets have to be stopped, and adding to his suspicions, adding to the suspicions of all the Western powers, communist movements in Greece and Turkey were active in 1946, 1947. Now, these communist movements were organized and led by indigenous people, that is, Greeks and Turks in their own countries, who are persuaded of the communist vision, are leading these movements. But it was very clear that these people were supported by the Soviets. And it was also clear that they were not a majority, they were armed minorities. And now Truman had seen enough. He was now convinced that communist ideology was driving the Soviet state to try to expand. And so in March of 1947, in one of the most important speeches and decisions, frankly, in American history of the 20th century, Truman appeared before both houses of Congress to ask for American aid for Greece and Turkey. In this request, he said to the American people, the United States must support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation that is being conquered by armed minorities. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world and the welfare of our own nation. Congress approved Truman's request, and his statement of America's policy to oppose communist aggression became known as the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is also often referred to simply as the policy of containment. That is, it's the Truman position to contain the spread of communism, to keep communism where it was, to not let it expand. That's containment. The Marshall Plan. There was another important part of the American plan to oppose communism. Communism, you see, is most persuasive in poor countries. Europe was such a place after World War II. The war had devastated much of the continent. Truman's Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, and Marshall, by the way, was the head of the American Army during the Second World War. This is the man that Dwight Eisenhower reports to, that Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific reported to, George C. Marshall. And now he is Truman's Secretary of State. And he came up with a plan to assist the Europeans in their recovery from the war. And the plan rightly bears his name, the Marshall Plan. Marshall now proposes to give huge amounts of American money to the European nations in order that they might rebuild their economies. And in the rebuilding of their economies, we would demonstrate to the Europeans that we do care, we are helping. And then the hope is that as we are helping and as they are getting out of the devastation caused by the war, that these nations then would be less susceptible to the communist argument. So it's humanitarian aid, but it has a political purpose to persuade European nations that the Americans care and that communism is not the answer to their problems. The Western European nations that took part in the Marshall Plan benefited enormously and were much more capable of dealing with their indigenous communist movements by virtue of the $13 billion that the Marshall Plan provided for the European nations. Indeed, in looking back on the Marshall Plan was probably the most successful aid program in world history. Dividing the world. By this time, 1947, it was obvious that the Soviets, the communists, and the Western freedom-loving nations were implacable foes. Consequently, the Western powers formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, still in existence today. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed in 1949 in an effort to defend the Western powers of the North Atlantic, broadly defined, should the Soviets launch an attack on the ground in Western Europe. And so now the world was divided into three parts. There was the communist world dominated by the Soviet Union. There was the free world led by the United States. And then there was what was called at the time, and for many years after, the third world. That is the rest of the world. By far the majority, and so more recently, the third world title has been dropped by most observers, historians, economists, etc. And it's called the majority world. Well, the contest between the free world and the communist world, the contest between the first two, would largely be played out on the ground of the third or majority world. Which brings us then to the Korean War, which we'll just discuss only briefly. But the Korean War was the most significant of such wars until the Vietnam War. And then in the 1960s, the Vietnam War seemed to dramatically overshadow the Korean War. But now, in about the year 2020, as we look back on it, the Vietnam War is sliding into obscurity. But given the division between the two Koreas, North and South Korea, the Korean War still seems to be very, very relevant. The Korean War began in June 1950 when communist North Korea invaded non-communist South Korea. Korea had been a Japanese colony for over a generation until the end of World War II. The Soviet Union at the end of the war liberated North Korea from the Japanese. And the United States liberated South Korea. So the two nations, the two great powers, they created governments in their own image. In North Korea, it is a communist government and is to this day. And South Korea, I wouldn't want to call it a democratic government at this time, but it was anti-communist, and it would move towards greater democracy over the decades. But the communists were not happy with only half of Korea. Just as today, their stated goal is to unify all of the Korean peninsula under a communist dictatorship. Now, it should be said, in all fairness, the goal of the South Korean government is eventually to unify all of Korea under a non-communist democratic government. And so when the North Koreans invaded the South Koreans, President Truman had a decision to make. And the decision he made was to initiate a military-style containment of North Korea. And so Truman sent troops to South Korea to help the South Koreans. And eventually this becomes a United Nations conflict. That is, the nations defending South Korea from the communist advance are under the auspices or authority of the United Nations. Now, obviously the Americans are supplying the bulk of troops and supplies and leadership, but nevertheless it's a United Nations conflict. Well, the Americans and their allies were able to eventually stabilize the situation, but there remains now two Koreas. There's North Korea, which is communist, and by the way, one of the poorest nations in the world. And then there is South Korea, which is non-communist and largely democratic, and it is one of the most prosperous small nations in the world. But the Korean problem, the problem between North and South Korea, continues to be a problem to this day. Summary. Cold War. In the summer of 1950, the Cold War grew hot in Korea, as it would in countless other third world or majority world places, the names of which were hardly known to Americans before the Cold War brought them to our attention. But Americans were determined to prevail in the conflict. Far from causing self-doubt and isolationism, their response after World War I, Korea served to demonstrate how determined the communists were to dominate the world. Americans now prepared to wage a long war of wills with the communist menace. The Cold War was not over with peace in Korea in 1953. It was only beginning. So what was my interpretation today? Was it the traditional view? Was it the revisionist view? That obviously is something I would put on a test. There's also important events along the way here, important people, but my interpretation would be front and center on the test regarding the Cold War. So I hope you tracked well with that. So God bless you, and hopefully I will, or you will, see me next time.